I am Joshua, 32 years old, and my own parents just called me uneducated trash and kicked me out of their house. Before I tell you about how they reacted when they realized they threw away the only person keeping them from financial ruin, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The heavy, solid oak front door slammed shut behind me with a sickening thud. The sound echoed down the quiet, manicured suburban street, cutting sharply through the freezing Ohio autumn air. Inside that house, the house I had grown up in, my father Robert was probably still standing at the head of the dining table. His face would still be that dangerous, explosive shade of crimson, his chest heaving after screaming at the top of his lungs. "Get out of my house, you lowlife. You are nothing but uneducated trash." Those words, they didn't just ring in my ears. They burned like battery acid against my brain. I stood on the concrete porch for a few long seconds. The freezing wind whipped across my face, stinging my cheeks, but I barely felt it. I didn't turn around. I didn't bang my fists against the wood. I didn't scream back. I just reached up, slowly adjusted the collar of my wool jacket, walked down the brick steps, and headed toward the dark driveway. My family had absolutely no idea who they had just thrown out. They genuinely thought I was just a college dropout, a stubborn failure struggling to sell a few cheap trinkets on the internet to make ends meet. They had no idea that I was the sole owner and CEO of a logistics and e-commerce empire valued at $20 million. They didn't know about the massive warehouses, my hundreds of employees, or the fact that my personal bank account held more wealth than our entire extended family had ever seen in their combined lifetimes. As my boots crunched against the gravel of the driveway, a strange, overwhelming sense of calm began to wash over me. The anger was there, buried deep down like a hot coal, but it was entirely overshadowed by a heavy, profound realization. I had spent my entire adult life trying to buy their love. I had bent over backward trying to earn a single nod of respect, a seat at their table. And it took this massive, humiliating explosion for me to finally see the absolute truth. You cannot buy respect from people who have already decided, long ago, that you are worthless. I stopped at the edge of the street and unlocked my car. It was a dark gray, custom-built Rolls-Royce. I had bought it a year ago to celebrate my company's biggest milestone, but I always parked it 2 blocks away when visiting my parents, so they wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. Tonight, I had parked it right at the curb. I slid into the driver's seat. The smell of premium, hand-stitched leather wrapped around me. I gripped the leather steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned completely white. I pressed the ignition. The quiet, powerful purr of the V12 motor vibrated beneath my feet. I pulled away from the curb and drove off into the pitch-black night. So I said, okay, fine, and didn't argue at all. The next day, I packed my bags and moved to my Florida beach house. But to truly understand how a simple family birthday dinner turned into an absolute war zone, I have to take you back. Just 24 hours before that explosive confrontation, I stood on that exact same concrete porch, holding a thick, heavy manila envelope in my hands. My heart was beating a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs, thumping so loud I was sure the neighbors could hear it. The air smelled of burning oak wood from the nearby chimneys and the damp, decaying autumn leaves covering the front lawn. It was the distinct smell of my childhood, a smell that always brought a tight knot of anxiety to my stomach. Tomorrow was my father's 60th birthday dinner. I had flown in from Florida 2 days early, renting a luxury hotel suite downtown, just to make sure every single detail of my plan was perfect. Inside the envelope I was gripping was the ultimate peace offering. It wasn't just a card or a check. It was a fully funded retirement account portfolio. I had sat down with my wealth manager and my personal lawyer specifically to set this up for my parents. It contained enough money, carefully invested in low-risk index funds and municipal bonds, to ensure that Robert and Martha would never have to worry about another mortgage payment, another sudden medical bill, or another property tax hike for the rest of their natural lives. I was literally holding their absolute financial freedom in my bare hands. I leaned my shoulder against the peeling white paint of the wooden porch railing, staring at the faded brass numbers nailed to the front door. Why was I shaking? Why was my mouth so dry? I was 32 years old. I was a self-made multimillionaire. I managed a massive business empire. I sat in glass boardrooms and negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts with ruthless, aggressive suppliers on a weekly basis without ever breaking a sweat. Yet, standing in front of my childhood home, I felt exactly like a scared, insecure 12-year-old boy hoping to show his stern parents a decent report card. The brutal truth was, I just wanted them to be proud of me. I wanted my father to look me in the eye, shake my hand firmly, and tell me I had done a good job. I wanted my mother to smile, touch my cheek, and tell me she never doubted my potential. For over 2 decades, I had lived entirely in the suffocating shadow of my older brother, Carter. Carter was the undisputed golden child of the family. He played varsity football, he went to a prestigious state university, he got the fancy business degree, he wore the tailored corporate suits. I was the black sheep, the rebel, the dropout, the ultimate disappointment. I traced the sharp paper edge of the envelope with my thumb, feeling the weight of the documents inside. I closed my eyes and imagined the look on my father's face when he opened it at the dinner table tomorrow night. I pictured him reading the numbers, his eyes widening in shock. I pictured him tearing up, realizing that his younger son, the one he had completely written off and verbally battered for years, was the one handing him a golden ticket to a stress-free old age. I imagined the entire dinner table going completely silent in awe. I had spent years meticulously hiding my success to avoid making Carter feel insecure, and to avoid my father's cynical, condescending lectures about how internet money isn't real money. But tomorrow was going to be different. I was finally going to step out of the shadows. I was finally going to claim my rightful place in this family. I took a deep, shuddering breath, shoved the heavy envelope into my leather briefcase, and turned away from the door. I walked back down the street to my rental car, a very modest, boring mid-sized sedan I had rented locally just to keep up appearances and not raise any red flags. I drove back to my hotel downtown. That night, I barely slept a wink. I tossed and turned in the crisp, cold white hotel sheets, staring up at the dark ceiling, running through every possible conversation in my head. I rehearsed exactly what I would say. I practiced keeping my voice level, calm, and humble. I did not want to sound arrogant. I did not want to rub it in their faces. I just wanted to share my reality, my success, with the people who brought me into this world. I wanted to finally belong. I had absolutely no idea that I was carrying a loaded bomb into a house completely soaked in gasoline. To truly understand the toxic dynamic of my family, you have to understand the specific Ohio suburb where we grew up. It was a pristine, cookie-cutter neighborhood where success was measured by a very strict, unforgiving, traditional ruler. You get straight A's, you go to a respectable college, you secure a corporate job with a guaranteed salary and dental benefits, and you buy a 2-story house with a white picket fence. My father, Robert, was a mid-level regional manager at a large insurance firm. He worshipped the corporate ladder with a religious fervor. My mother, Martha, was a quiet homemaker who treated my father's every word like absolute, unquestionable law. From the very beginning, my older brother Carter fit their mold perfectly. When Carter was in high school, my parents proudly talked about his college fund at every single Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. They would boast loudly to the aunts and uncles about how Carter was destined for upper management, how his grades were flawless, how his future was set in stone. I, on the other hand, was wired completely differently. While Carter was busy joining the debate club to pad his college applications, I was in the dusty, freezing garage taking apart old computers. By the time I was 12 years old, I was buying broken laptops from neighbors for $5, fixing the motherboards, replacing the hard drives, and selling them online for $100. I loved the hustle. I loved the raw mechanics of business. I loved creating value out of nothing. But my parents did not see it as a talent. They saw it as an embarrassing distraction. Joshua, get out of that dirty garage and do your algebra. My father would bark, standing in the doorway with his arms tightly crossed over his chest, his jaw set in a hard line. You think peddling junk on the internet is going to pay the bills? You need a real career. Look at your brother. He respects his future. I would quietly close the laptop, wash the dark grease off my hands in the laundry room sink, and go upstairs to my room. I learned very early on that my passions were considered worthless in that house. I was a square peg in a round hole, and they were determined to smash me into shape, no matter how much it hurt. The absolute breaking point happened when I was 19 years old. I had enrolled in a local community college purely to keep the peace and stop the daily lectures. I hated every single second of it. The professors were teaching outdated business theories from textbooks written 20 years ago. I was already making $2,000 a month running a small, highly efficient e-commerce dropshipping store right from my cramped dorm room. One rainy Tuesday evening, I drove home and sat my parents down in the living room. The television was playing the evening news softly in the background. I took a deep breath, looked my father in the eye, and told them I was dropping out of college to focus on my business full-time. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. Then my father exploded. He stood up so fast his heavy armchair slid backward across the carpet with a loud screech. "You are doing what?" he roared, his face instantly turning a deep, terrifying shade of crimson. "You are throwing your entire life away. You think you are smarter than everyone else? You are nothing. You will never have a real salary. You are going to be a loser flipping burgers for the rest of your miserable life." My mother sat frozen on the floral sofa, wringing her hands nervously in her lap, staring blankly at the floor. She did not defend me. She never did. "Dad, my business is already making real money," I tried to explain, fighting to keep my voice steady despite the shaking in my hands. "I have a solid business plan. I know what I'm doing. I don't want to hear about your stupid little internet schemes," he yelled, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger right at my face. "If you walk out of that school, you get nothing from us. No help, no roof over your head, nothing. You are entirely on your own." I looked at him. I looked at my mother, who refused to meet my gaze. I realized in that split second that they would rather see me miserable and conventional than happy and unconventional. "Fine," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I walked upstairs, packed my bags that night, and moved out. The front door locked behind me, and my safety net vanished into thin air. Those first few years on my own were absolutely brutal. My father's cruel words haunted me every single time I hit a roadblock or lost a customer. I rented a tiny, miserable, drafty apartment directly above a loud, smoky dive bar. I ate cheap ramen noodles for almost every meal and worked grueling 18-hour days. My first 2 business attempts failed spectacularly. I lost all my meager savings. There were cold winter nights I lay on my cheap, lumpy mattress, staring up at the yellow water stains on the ceiling, listening to the bass thumping from the bar below, wondering if my dad was right. Was I just an uneducated loser destined to fail? Then the universe threw me an incredible lifeline. His name was Christopher. He was a wealthy, retired logistics mogul in his late 60s who happened to attend a local business networking meetup that I had sneaked into because I couldn't afford the entry fee. I nervously pitched him my ambitious idea for a platform connecting local American manufacturers directly with consumers, the blueprint for what would eventually become Heartland Made. Christopher did not ask to see my college degree. He didn't care about my GPA. He looked at my detailed financial projections, he scrutinized my business model, and then he looked me dead in the eye. "You have the grit, kid," he said, tapping the wooden table with his expensive gold pen. Over the next 2 years, Christopher became the father figure I desperately needed and never had. He mentored me. He taught me complex supply chain management, aggressive negotiation tactics, and global scaling strategies. One night, over expensive steaks at a downtown restaurant, I finally confessed my deep, lingering insecurity about being a college dropout. Christopher laughed out loud, a booming, genuine sound. "Joshua, I dropped out of high school," he said, taking a slow sip of his red wine. "The free market doesn't care about a piece of paper. The market only cares about value. Business is the most ruthless, honest university in the world. You are already a scholar." That single conversation changed the entire trajectory of my life. The heavy mental chains my father had locked around my brain finally snapped. I stopped feeling inferior. I poured my entire soul into Heartland Made, and the company began to explode. By the time I turned 25, Heartland Made hit its first major milestone: $1 million in annual revenue. I moved out of that depressing apartment above the bar and leased a massive, state-of-the-art commercial warehouse on the edge of the city. I hired a team of dedicated, brilliant employees. My days became a high-speed whirlwind of international supplier meetings, complex logistics planning, and aggressive digital marketing campaigns. I was a CEO holding the reins of a rapidly growing, highly profitable empire. But you would absolutely never know it if you saw me at a family gathering. Whenever the holidays rolled around, I would intentionally drive an older, modest, beat-up sedan to my parents' house. I wore plain, unbranded clothes. I meticulously downplayed my success. Why? Because the few times I had tentatively tried to mention a small business victory, the room would instantly go ice cold. Carter would roll his eyes dramatically, and my father would quickly clear his throat and change the subject to Carter's recent promotion at the regional bank. Carter loved using the word promotion. It was his absolute favorite weapon to remind everyone in the room that he was steadily climbing the respectable corporate ladder, while I was just selling stuff online. I would sit at the far end of the Thanksgiving table, quietly eating my turkey, listening to Carter boast loudly about his mid-level management title and his impressive salary bracket. I wore a practiced mask of polite indifference. Inside, it was an incredibly lonely existence. I was sitting on top of a mountain of success, but I could not share the view with the people I loved. I kept my mouth shut and let them believe I was just scraping by. I thought it was the noble thing to do. I convinced myself that protecting their fragile egos was my ultimate duty as a son. The real, agonizing test of my family loyalty came 2 years later. My mother was suddenly diagnosed with a severe, aggressive illness. The specialized medical bills piled up horrifyingly fast. My father's corporate insurance, the one he always bragged about, refused to cover the experimental treatments she desperately needed. I vividly remember standing in the hallway, watching my father sit at the kitchen table, his head buried in his hands, looking older and more defeated than I had ever seen him. He was quietly talking to my mother about taking out a second mortgage. It would have ruined them completely. It would have been a financial funeral for their hard-earned retirement. I did not hesitate for a single second. I contacted the hospital administration through my company's legal entity and anonymously paid the entire $75,000 balance via wire transfer. When my parents received the zero balance statement in the mail, they cried and assumed a miraculous charity fund at the hospital had covered it. My mother wept tears of joy. I just smiled softly and hugged her, keeping my secret safe. 6 months later, Carter decided he needed to buy a large, expensive house in an upscale neighborhood to perfectly match his new promotion. But Carter lived way beyond his means. He had terrible credit. He did not have the down payment, and his bank was preparing to reject his loan. Knowing his massive pride would never allow him to accept a dime from his loser little brother, I orchestrated a complex, fake loan. I funneled $40,000 to an old, distant uncle we barely spoke to, and had him lend the money to Carter. The absolute worst part? A month later, at a family summer barbecue, Carter stood by the grill holding a craft beer, bragging loudly to our cousins about his strict financial discipline. "It takes a lot of hard work and smart saving to buy a house like mine," he proclaimed, making sure he spoke loud enough for me to hear him. "You just have to be smart with your salary." I gripped my flimsy paper plate so hard it bent in half. I swallowed the bitter truth, forcing a tight smile. I let him have his moment, sacrificing my own dignity just to keep his intact. The final nail in the coffin of my silent martyrdom was my younger sister, Sarah. Sarah was the baby of the family, easily influenced, incredibly vain, and always desperate for our parents' approval. She was engaged to a guy named David. David was a massive snob with a master's degree in communications who looked down on me almost as much as my father did. Exactly 3 months before their extravagant, overly expensive wedding, David lost his job. He was let go during a sudden corporate restructuring. They were panicking. They were going to lose the luxury venue, the high-end caterers, everything. Sarah called me late one night, sobbing hysterically into the phone. She knew I had a business, even if she didn't know the actual scale of it. Without a second thought, I transferred $50,000 directly into her bank account to save the wedding. I told her to consider it my ultimate wedding gift and begged her to keep it completely between us so David wouldn't feel emasculated. The wedding was beautiful. I stood in the back of the lavish reception hall, watching them dance, feeling a genuine, warm happiness that I could provide that perfect day for her. But later that evening, during the toasts, Sarah took the microphone. She thanked our parents. She thanked David's parents. And then, she looked directly at Carter's table. "And a special thank you to my big brother Carter," she said, her voice echoing clearly through the massive speakers, "for always being the solid rock of this family, the one we all look up to, the ultimate standard of success we all strive for." She didn't even mention my name. Not once. I stood near the open bar, holding a glass of club soda. David walked past me later, patted my shoulder condescendingly, and smirked. "Maybe one day you'll figure out a real career, Josh. Don't worry, we can't all be Carter." I sipped my drink, the ice cold against my teeth. The betrayal stung worse than a physical slap across the face. That was the exact moment I decided the painful charade was over. My father's 60th birthday was coming up. It was time to pull the curtain back. The week before my father's birthday, my life in the business world hit an incredible, dizzying peak. I sat in a sleek, glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of a high-rise in downtown Chicago. Across from me sat Adrian, a senior partner at one of the most ruthless private equity firms in the country. Adrian was a corporate shark, a man who crushed small businesses for breakfast. But right then, he was looking at my financial portfolios with a look of absolute, undeniable respect. "Joshua," Adrian said, sliding a thick, heavily redacted legal document across the polished mahogany table, "your year-over-year growth is absolutely staggering. Your supply chain logistics are bulletproof. We just finished the independent audit. Heartland Made is officially valued at a solid $20 million. And honestly, looking at the Q4 projections, I think that number is highly conservative." I stared down at the paperwork. $20 million. I thought back to the freezing winter nights in my tiny apartment above the bar, eating cheap noodles, terrified of failing, terrified my father was right. I looked over at Wyatt, my chief operating officer, who was sitting next to me. Wyatt grinned broadly and gave me a subtle, proud nod. We had built an absolute empire from the ground up, with our own blood, sweat, and tears. I picked up my pen and signed the preliminary partnership agreements. To celebrate the valuation, I did something I had wanted to do for a very long time. I hired a top-tier real estate lawyer named Dylan. I flew down to Naples, Florida, and I bought a stunning, multi-million-dollar beachfront house in straight cash. It had gorgeous floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean, a massive wraparound wooden deck, and private beach access. It was going to be my sanctuary. Dylan made sure the title, the deed, and all the assets were completely locked down in a private trust. I was legally and financially bulletproof. I had the wealth, the legal protection, and the respect of the industry titans. I was no longer the scared teenager seeking validation from a father who couldn't see my worth. I was a king in my own right. Armed with this unshakable reality, I boarded a first-class flight back to Ohio for my father's birthday dinner. I was finally ready for the storm. I arrived at my parents' house right on time. As I walked into the dining room, the atmosphere was already thick with the usual, suffocating family politics. The good silver, the ones my mother only brought out for holidays, was laid out perfectly. A massive, perfectly cooked roast sat in the center of the table. My father sat at the head, holding court, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. Carter and his wife were sitting to his right, practically glowing with self-importance. Sarah and David were to his left. "There he is, the internet entrepreneur," David sneered loudly as I pulled out my chair. He explicitly emphasized the word entrepreneur, using obnoxious air quotes with his fingers, drawing a loud, approving chuckle from Carter. I didn't flinch. I just smiled, a calm, chilling smile, and sat down quietly. During the dinner, it was the Carter and David show as usual. Carter spent 20 unbroken minutes talking about his bank's quarterly earnings as if he had personally engineered the global economy. David, who had recently managed to secure a new mid-level job after months of unemployment, loudly debated the state of the stock market with my father. They used big, unnecessarily complicated words, posturing like profound intellectuals. My mother continuously fawned over Carter, serving him the best cuts of meat. I sat quietly, meticulously cutting my food, observing them all like a scientist watching lab rats in a maze. The tension inside my chest was coiling tighter and tighter. I looked down the table at my father. He looked so incredibly proud of Carter. He looked at David with genuine respect. But whenever his eyes drifted over to me, the warmth instantly vanished, replaced by a subtle, familiar look of pity and deep disappointment. He thought I was the weak link. He thought I was the failure of the bloodline. My right hand rested casually on my leather briefcase sitting on the floor next to my chair. The envelope was inside, the ticking time bomb. I took a slow sip of ice water, my face a mask of absolute, unreadable calm. Let them talk. Let them inflate their fragile egos to the absolute maximum limit. Because the higher they floated in their delusion, the harder they were going to crash into reality. The heavy dinner plates were finally cleared away, and my mother proudly brought out a large, decadent chocolate birthday cake. We all sang the song, the melody feeling incredibly hollow to my ears. My father blew out the candles, soaking in the applause and adoration from his favorite children. As my mother began carefully slicing the cake, a quiet, expectant lull fell over the dining table. "So, Josh," Carter said, leaning far back in his chair, casually picking his teeth with a wooden toothpick. "How's the little online shop doing? You moving enough inventory out of your garage to pay rent this month?" I placed my silver fork down on the table. The sharp metallic clink sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I looked directly into Carter's smug eyes, then slowly shifted my gaze down the table to my father. "Actually," I said, my voice incredibly steady and crystal clear, "the business is doing exceptionally well. We just closed a massive audit with a top private equity firm in Chicago. Heartland Made was officially valued at $20 million. The entire table froze instantly. My mother's knife stopped dead halfway through the chocolate cake. Sarah blinked rapidly, looking confused. David scoffed, a nervous, high-pitched sound escaping his throat. My father let out a harsh, barking, deeply condescending laugh. $20 million? Please, Joshua. Stop making up ridiculous fairy tales at my dinner table." "It's not a fairy tale, Dad," I replied calmly, not breaking eye contact. "I own a massive national logistics network. I have dozens of full-time employees. I just bought a beachfront mansion in Florida in cash. I wanted to share this huge milestone with you all tonight." My father's face hardened immediately. The cruel amusement vanished, replaced by a dark, ugly, simmering resentment. "It's all fake internet numbers," he sneered, pointing his dessert fork aggressively at me. "It's a scam. You play around on your computer and pretend you're a real businessman. You don't have a degree. You don't have a real profession. Don't come into my house and try to act like you're better than your brother just because you got lucky with some tech scam." My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but my hands remained completely, terrifyingly steady. I reached down to the floor, opened the brass clasps of my briefcase, and pulled out the thick manila envelope. I tossed it onto the center of the dining table. It slid smoothly across the polished wood and stopped right in front of my father's plate. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "That is a fully funded retirement account. There's enough money in there so you and Mom never have to worry about a single bill or a single mortgage payment for the rest of your lives." My father stared at the envelope as if it were a live, venomous snake. He didn't touch it. Instead, his face turned a dark, explosive purple. "What is this?" he bellowed, slamming his heavy fist on the table. The wine glasses rattled violently. "You think you can come in here and hand out charity? You think you can buy my respect with your dirty internet money? I worked an honest job my whole life. I don't need handouts from an uneducated dropout." "It's not charity," I fired back, leaning forward, the anger finally bleeding into my voice. "It's exactly what I've been doing for this family for years, while you all treated me like garbage." Carter scoffed loudly, crossing his arms. "What are you talking about, you psycho?" I turned my head and locked eyes with Carter. "Your house, Carter. The 40 grand you got from Uncle Pete for the down payment? Uncle Pete is broke. That was my money. I paid for your house because you were too busy trying to look rich on a middle management salary to actually save a dime." Carter's face instantly drained of all color. His jaw dropped open in pure shock. I didn't stop. I turned to my mother, who was trembling violently. "The $75,000 in medical bills 2 years ago? The anonymous hospital charity? That was me, Mom. I paid it in full so Dad wouldn't lose this house." My mother covered her mouth, a choked gasp escaping her lips. Finally, I looked at Sarah. She was shrinking back into her chair, her eyes wide with absolute panic. "And your perfect wedding, Sarah? When David lost his job and you were crying on the phone? The $50,000 that saved your big day? That came straight from my bank account. And you repaid me by standing up at your reception and praising Carter." The silence in the dining room was deafening. The air was completely sucked out of the room. I had laid every single card on the table. Every single layer of their pride, their arrogance, and their fake superiority was stripped away, leaving them completely naked in the harsh, blinding light of the truth. I expected shock. I expected, maybe, just a tiny sliver of gratitude or a tearful apology. I was incredibly, stupidly naive. The humiliation was simply too much for their fragile, inflated egos to bear. Instead of thanking me, they turned into vicious, cornered animals. Carter stood up abruptly, his chair crashing to the hardwood floor behind him. "You manipulative piece of trash!" he screamed, the veins in his neck popping. "You did this secretly just to hold it over our heads. You think you're God." Sarah burst into fake, incredibly loud defensive tears. "How could you bring this up at Dad's birthday? You ruined everything, Joshua. You're so selfish," she wailed, turning her back to me and burying her face in David's chest. David glared at me, too cowardly to actually speak, but his eyes were full of pure, unadulterated venom. Then my father rose to his feet. He was trembling with a rage so deep, so absolute, it was terrifying to witness. He grabbed the envelope I had placed on the table and threw it directly at my chest. It bounced off my jacket, scattering the expensive financial documents across the floor. "You listen to me," he snarled, his voice a low, vicious growl that filled the room. "I don't care how much money you stole or scammed. You are nothing. You hear me? You are still just uneducated trash. You will never be Carter. You will never be the son I wanted." He pointed a shaking, furious finger at the front door. "Get out of my house, you lowlife. Get out and never come back." I stood up slowly. I looked at my mother. She looked away, staring blankly at the wall, choosing to protect her husband's pride over her son one last time. I looked at Carter's furious, humiliated face. I looked at Sarah's fake tears. "Keep the money I gave you," I said, my voice eerily, deadly calm. "Consider it the final price of my freedom." I turned my back on them forever. I walked down the hallway, opened the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the freezing night. I walked to my dark gray Rolls-Royce, got in, and drove away. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please help me like the video and leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you've been with me this far. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. I didn't drive back to my rented sedan. I couldn't bear the thought of sitting in that cheap car. I drove the Rolls-Royce straight to the most expensive, luxurious hotel downtown, tossing the keys blindly to the shocked valet. I walked straight into the penthouse suite, the heavy mahogany doors clicking shut behind me, sealing me off from the toxic world I had just escaped. I threw my wool jacket onto the velvet sofa and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The city of Columbus spread out below me, a vast, glowing grid of orange streetlights and dark, silent office buildings. My phone buzzed aggressively in my pocket. It was a text from Sarah. I pulled it out and stared at the glowing screen. "You need to call Dad and apologize right now. You embarrassed everyone. You are tearing this family apart. David is furious." I let out a harsh, dry, broken laugh. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt entirely hollow, like someone had scooped out my insides with a spoon. I walked over to the minibar, poured a glass of sparkling water, and sat at the heavy glass desk in the corner of the room. I opened my laptop, connected to the Wi-Fi, and logged into my banking portals. I started pulling up the transaction histories from the past few years. There it was, highlighted in cold, hard, undeniable digital ink. The $75,000 wire transfer for the medical bills. The $40,000 cashier's check routed to the fake uncle for Carter's house. The $50,000 direct deposit to Sarah for the wedding. Plus all the little things over the years, paying off a credit card here, covering a major car repair there. Almost $300,000. I stared at the numbers until my vision blurred with unshed tears. I had bled myself dry, both financially and emotionally, pouring my life force into a bottomless pit of entitlement and ungratefulness. I realized then that David's past brutal divorce and his bitter, ongoing custody battles, which Sarah constantly complained about at family gatherings, were just symptoms of the incredibly toxic people my family chose to surround themselves with. They were all users. They fed on drama, they fed on pride, and they fed on each other. And I was the ultimate battery they had plugged into to power their delusions of grandeur. My finger hovered over the screen. I blocked Sarah's number. Then I blocked Carter's number. Finally, I blocked my parents' landline and their cell phones. I sat in the silent hotel room, watching the city sleep below me, feeling a bizarre, overwhelming mixture of profound grief and sudden, absolute lightness. The rusted chain was finally broken. The heavy anchor had been cut. I was drifting in the open ocean, alone, but for the first time in my entire life, I was the undisputed captain of the ship. The next morning, the sun rose pale and weak over the gray Ohio skyline. I hadn't slept a wink. At 8 a.m. sharp, I opened my laptop and initiated a secure video call with Dr. Aaron, my therapist based in Chicago. I had been working with him privately for 6 months, desperately trying to navigate the crippling anxiety and guilt my family constantly caused me. When Dr. Aaron's kind, familiar face appeared on the screen, I broke down. I told him everything. I recounted the dinner, the screams, the thrown envelope, and the devastating, heart-shattering realization that my mother would never, ever protect me. Dr. Aaron listened quietly, his face serious, taking notes on his pad. When I finished, he leaned forward, looking right into the camera. "Joshua," he said in his calm, incredibly steady voice, "what you experienced last night was the total collapse of a narcissistic family system. You disrupted their entire false narrative. In their story, Carter is the shining success and you are the ultimate failure. By proving you are overwhelmingly successful, you threaten their entire reality. They didn't attack you because you did something wrong. They attacked you because they were terrified of facing their own massive inadequacy. You didn't lose a family last night. You escaped a cult." Hearing a highly educated medical professional validate my reality was like taking a massive, deep breath of pure oxygen after drowning underwater for 32 years. The heavy, suffocating blanket of guilt that had been clinging to my chest for decades completely evaporated. I closed the laptop and immediately called Wyatt, my COO. Wyatt, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in years. I'm not coming back to the Chicago office. I'm heading straight to Florida. I'll run the executive meetings remotely from the beach house. Understood, boss, Wyatt replied without missing a single beat. Take all the time you need. We've got the fort secured. I packed my single suitcase. I drove to my small, modest apartment in Ohio, the fake one I kept just for visits to maintain my cover. I called a local charity and told them they could come take absolutely everything. The cheap furniture, the TV, the clothes in the closet. I left the keys on the kitchen counter. It felt like attending a funeral for a version of myself that didn't exist anymore. I drove the Rolls-Royce to the private airfield where I had chartered a jet. As the sleek plane accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the gray Ohio sky, I looked out the window. I watched the suburban sprawl, the tiny houses with their white picket fences, shrink into meaningless little squares below me. I was leaving behind 32 years of seeking approval from ghosts. I was heading to the ocean. I was heading to my new life. The storm was finally behind me, and the sun was waiting in Florida. The physical sensation of stepping off that private jet in Naples, Florida, was something I will never forget. It was late afternoon, and the air was thick, warm, and smelled strongly of salt and blooming jasmine. Leaving the freezing, bitter gray skies of Ohio behind felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating suit of armor I had been forced to wear my entire life. I had my driver take me straight to the beachfront property. When I unlocked the heavy glass front door of my new house, the absolute silence of the place hit me. It was not a lonely silence. It was a healing, profound quiet. The house featured massive, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an uninterrupted, breathtaking view of the Gulf of Mexico. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of crushed orange, deep purple, and vibrant pink. I walked out onto the expansive wooden deck, took off my shoes, and felt the warm wood under my feet. For the first time in 32 years, my heart was not racing. My stomach was not tied in knots anticipating the next insult or the next condescending lecture from my father. I was completely, utterly safe. The first few weeks were a period of intense detox. I ran my $20 million empire directly from a sleek home office overlooking the beach. Video conferencing allowed me to manage my team without missing a single beat. My chief operating officer, Wyatt, handled the physical warehouses in Chicago, while I focused on the high-level global strategy. Without the constant, draining mental bandwidth of my family's toxic drama, my productivity absolutely skyrocketed. But I needed a life outside of work. That is when I met Gray. Gray was a retired commercial real estate developer in his late 50s. I met him early one morning at a local high-end coffee shop down the street. We struck up a conversation about a classic car parked outside, and we immediately hit it off. Gray was a self-made man, entirely unpretentious, and possessed a razor-sharp wit. When I eventually told him my story, the dropout status, the secret success, the explosive family dinner, he didn't judge me. He just nodded knowingly and bought my next cup of coffee. Through Gray, I was introduced to a vibrant, authentic local community. This became my chosen family. They were entrepreneurs, artists, retired executives, and local business owners. None of them cared about my lack of a college degree. None of them asked me about my high school GPA. They cared about my character, my work ethic, and the value I brought to a conversation. We hosted weekend barbecues on my deck, laughing late into the night. It was an entirely different world. In Ohio, my worth was measured by an outdated, rigid checklist. Here in Florida, my worth was measured by the man I had actually become. I was healing day by day, wave by wave. Exactly 6 weeks into my new, peaceful life, the illusion of complete isolation was violently shattered. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was sitting on the deck, reviewing some supply chain contracts on my tablet, when the security chime on my front gate rang. I checked the camera feed on my phone. My blood ran completely cold for a fraction of a second, followed immediately by a surge of hot, burning annoyance. Standing at my front gate, wearing a poorly fitted linen shirt and sweating profusely in the Florida humidity, was my older brother, Carter. I buzzed him in. I wanted to see exactly what kind of audacity this required. I met him at the front door. Carter walked into the massive, sunlit foyer and literally stopped in his tracks. His eyes darted around, taking in the imported marble floors, the modern art on the walls, and the sweeping view of the ocean directly ahead. For a moment, the arrogant, golden child mask slipped completely, revealing raw, unadulterated envy. "Wow," Carter breathed, his voice tight. "You weren't kidding. This place is a lot." "What do you want, Carter?" I asked. I didn't offer him a drink. I didn't invite him to sit down. I stood in the center of the foyer with my arms crossed. Carter forced a stiff, unnatural smile and awkwardly patted my shoulder. "Come on, Josh. It's been over a month. The dust has settled. I happened to be down in Miami for a banking conference, so I figured I would drive over and see my little brother. Family is family, right? Family doesn't scream at each other and call them uneducated trash," I replied, my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. Carter sighed dramatically, playing the victim. "Look, Dad was out of line. We all were just surprised. You hid this massive secret from us. We felt ambushed, but I'm here to build a bridge, man. In fact, I wanted to talk to you about a business opportunity." I almost laughed out loud. "A business opportunity?" "Yeah," Carter said, pulling at the collar of his sweaty shirt. "Look, I'm up for a massive promotion at the bank. Regional vice president. But it's highly competitive. The senior partners care a lot about image. They want someone who looks the part of a wealthy, successful leader. My current salary is decent, but it's totally tied up in the mortgage you helped with, which I appreciate. But to really seal this promotion, I need to upgrade my image. I'm looking at buying a Porsche 911. A sleek, black Porsche. It screams success." I stared at him, genuinely fascinated by the absolute depths of his delusion. "You drove all the way across the state of Florida to ask me for a loan to buy a sports car so you can fake your way into a promotion? It's an investment in my career," Carter argued, his voice rising, the old entitlement flaring up instantly. "You have $20 million, Joshua. 100 grand for a Porsche is pocket change for you. Consider it an investment in the family name. I'll pay you back when the new salary kicks in." "No," I said simply. Carter blinked, stunned. "What do you mean, no? I'm your brother." "You are a parasite, Carter," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "For my entire life, you mocked me. You looked down on me. You paraded your little degree around like it made you a god. And the second you find out I have actual money, you show up at my house begging for a toy car to impress men who don't care about you. This is not a bank. I am not your ATM." Carter's face turned bright red. The fake smile vanished entirely, replaced by the ugly, bitter older brother I had always known. "You selfish prick," he spat. "You get a little lucky with an internet company and you think you can treat me like dirt? I am treating you exactly the way you treated me," I said, stepping forward, forcing him to take a step back toward the door. "Except I actually earned my life. Now get out of my house before I have security throw you out." Carter glared at me, his chest heaving. He turned around, ripped the front door open, and marched out into the driveway. I watched him get into his cheap rental car and speed away, kicking up white gravel. I locked the door behind him. I didn't feel angry. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of victory. The golden child had just begged the black sheep for a handout, and the black sheep had slammed the door in his face. The final destruction of my family's false narrative came completely by accident a few weeks later. I had been working closely with my corporate lawyer, Dylan. Dylan was a brilliant legal mind who handled all of my trust and asset protection. I had instructed him to set up a massive, fully funded college fund and entrepreneurship scholarship program in my name, based back in my home state of Ohio. The scholarship was specifically designed for high school graduates who didn't have perfect academic records but showed incredible, raw entrepreneurial talent. I wanted to give kids like the old me the exact lifeline I never had. A prominent business journalist named Julian, who wrote for a major regional financial magazine in the Midwest, caught wind of the massive endowment being processed through Dylan's firm. Julian started digging. He pulled public records, tracked the corporate filings of Heartland Made, and connected the dots. Without warning me, Julian published a massive 6-page feature article. The headline read, "From College Dropout to $20 Million Empire. The Secret Life of Ohio's Quietest Tycoon." The article was incredibly detailed. It outlined my early failures, the massive valuation of Heartland Made, my pristine beachfront property in Florida, and the millions I was pouring into the new scholarship fund. Painted me as a visionary self-made genius. The article went absolutely viral on LinkedIn, Facebook, and local Ohio news platforms. It hit my hometown like a nuclear bomb. My phone, which I had eventually unblocked just to monitor the inevitable fallout, began to explode. Notifications lit up the screen like a slot machine paying out a jackpot. Suddenly, every single aunt, uncle, cousin, and old high school acquaintance who had ignored me for a decade was blowing up my phone. "Hey Josh, so proud of you. We always knew you were special." Read a text from an aunt who had once told me I was wasting my life. "Bro, we need to catch up. Dinner on me next time you're in town." Read a message from a cousin who used to make fun of my cheap clothes at family reunions. It was utterly nauseating. The sheer, transparent hypocrisy of it all was disgusting. They didn't love me. They loved the $20 million attached to my name. But the most pathetic message came 3 days later. It was a long text from my mother. "Joshua, honey, Dad and I read the article. It is so wonderful. We are so incredibly proud of the man you have become. Dad admits things got a little out of hand at the birthday dinner. It was just a big misunderstanding. We were all stressed. We want to come down to Florida next week to visit you and see your beautiful new house. Let's put the past behind us. We love you." A big misunderstanding. That was her description of my father calling me uneducated trash, throwing my gift at me, and banishing me from my childhood home. A misunderstanding. I sat on my deck, staring at the text, shaking my head. I realized that if I let them back in without consequence, nothing would ever change. They would just learn to hide their disrespect behind fake smiles to maintain access to my wealth. It was time for the final confrontation. It was time to set the ironclad laws of my universe. I replied to my mother with a single brief message. "You can fly down, but you are not staying at my house. We will meet for lunch at the Coastal Country Club on Tuesday at noon. Don't be late." Tuesday arrived with bright, blistering Florida sunshine. I booked a private, secluded table on the outdoor terrace of the most exclusive, high-end country club in Naples. The view was immaculate, overlooking the manicured green golf course and the sparkling blue ocean beyond. I wore a tailored, lightweight linen suit. I looked the part, and more importantly, I felt the part. At exactly noon, the hostess led my parents to the table. They looked entirely out of their element. My father, Robert, wore a stiff, uncomfortable suit that looked too heavy for the tropical climate. He looked diminished. The towering, intimidating patriarch of my childhood suddenly looked like a tired, anxious old man. My mother, Martha, trailed closely behind him, clutching her purse with white knuckles, her eyes darting nervously around the wealthy patrons surrounding us. I stood up, offered a polite but incredibly brief nod, and sat back down. I didn't hug them. My father cleared his throat loudly, immediately trying to seize control of the dynamic just like he always did in Ohio. "Well, Joshua," he said, picking up the menu, "this is quite a place. Let me treat you to lunch. What are we having?" "I've already ordered for the table," I said smoothly, cutting him off completely. "And I am paying. You are a guest in my town." Robert's jaw tightened, a brief flash of the old anger appearing in his eyes, but he quickly swallowed it down. He forced a smile. "Right? Well, it's good to see you, son. That article, it was really something. We had no idea the scale of your operation. You had no idea because you never asked. I replied, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the white tablecloth. You never asked because you assumed I was a failure. Let's not pretend this is a happy family reunion, Dad. You didn't fly down here because you suddenly love me more. You flew down here because the entire town of Columbus now knows your dropout son is a multimillionaire. And it looks terribly embarrassing for you to be estranged from the family success story. My mother gasped softly, reaching out to touch my arm. Joshua, please, don't speak to your father that way. We just want to be a family again. I pulled my arm back gently, avoiding her touch. Mom, you sat on that floral couch for 20 years and watched him verbally abuse me. You watched him kick me out of the house. You don't get to play the loving peacemaker now just because I have a bank account you respect. Robert's face flushed red. Now listen here, Joshua. I may have lost my temper at the dinner, but you provoked me. You humiliated us in front of Carter and Sarah with all that talk about paying for their lives. I exposed the truth. I shot back, my voice hardening, dropping to a low, commanding register that carried absolute authority. I exposed the fact that the golden children you worship are entirely dependent on the black sheep you despise. Let me tell you something about Sarah and David. Since that dinner, David's insecurity has spiraled out of control. I heard through the grapevine that they are already sleeping in separate bedrooms. He's dragging all his toxic baggage from his past divorce and his miserable custody battles into Sarah's life, and she is miserable. But you still praise them because David has a master's degree. It's pathetic. I leaned back in my chair, staring them down. I am going to make this incredibly clear. I am not the son you can control anymore. That dinner in Ohio, that was the funeral for the weak, desperate boy who just wanted his daddy's approval. That boy is dead and buried. I don't care about your approval. I don't care about your estate, and I don't want a single dime of your inheritance. I have my own empire. My father stared at me, his mouth slightly open, completely shell-shocked. He had never, in his entire life, been spoken to with such raw, unyielding dominance. If we are going to have any semblance of a relationship moving forward, I continued, laying down the law, it will be entirely on my terms. There will be no passive-aggressive comments about my education. There will be no comparisons to Carter. There will be absolute, unconditional respect. If you cross that line even once, I will cut you off permanently, and you will never see or hear from me again. Do you understand? The silence stretched out over the table. The ocean breeze rustled the palm trees above us. Finally, my father looked down at his lap, the fight completely drained out of him. The ultimate realization had hit him. He had absolutely no leverage. His currency of approval was utterly worthless to me now. I understand, my father whispered quietly. My mother nodded frantically, tears welling in her eyes. We understand, Joshua. We just want you in our lives. Good, I said, picking up my water glass. Now let's eat. After a quiet, incredibly subdued lunch, I had my driver take them back to their hotel. I didn't invite them to the house. Boundaries have to be enforced immediately and without exception. Later that evening, I stood alone on the massive wooden balcony of my Florida mansion. The sun was melting into the Gulf of Mexico, casting a brilliant, fiery glow across the water. I held a glass of expensive bourbon, the ice clinking softly against the crystal glass. I looked out at the endless horizon, taking a deep, fulfilling breath of the salty air. The heavy, dark storm cloud of my childhood had finally broken. I had faced the ultimate demons of my past, looked them dead in the eye, and conquered them. I realized something profound as the stars began to appear in the night sky. Family is a powerful word. We are conditioned from birth to believe that blood ties are an unbreakable contract, a sacred bond that forces us to endure abuse, neglect, and profound disrespect. But that is a lie. Blood makes you related. Loyalty, respect, and mutual unconditional love make you family. I had spent decades trying to fit into a mold that was designed to crush my spirit. I had given hundreds of thousands of dollars to people who took my money with one hand and slapped my face with the other. But no more. I had reclaimed my narrative. I was a dropout. I was an entrepreneur. I was a survivor. And most importantly, I was incredibly, undeniably happy. I had built a chosen family around me here in Florida. People who celebrated my victories instead of feeling threatened by them. The scars from my past would probably always be there, a faint reminder of where I came from. But they no longer defined where I was going. I had taken back the pen, and I was finally writing my own story. As I look back on this incredible journey, there is a vital, life-changing lesson I want to share with every single one of you watching. Never, ever let anyone else define your intrinsic value, especially those who demand you shrink yourself to fit their narrow worldview. Whether it is a demanding boss, a toxic partner, or even your own parents, no one has the right to treat you like a second-class citizen. Real success isn't just about the money in your bank account, the impressive title on your door, or the fancy degree hanging on your wall. Real success is the quiet, unshakable confidence of knowing your own worth and possessing the absolute courage to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. It is okay to protect your peace. It is okay to mourn the family you wished you had, while celebrating the beautiful, chosen family you create for yourself. I really want to know what part of my journey resonated with you the most. What is the biggest lesson you are taking away from this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Or, if this story simply struck a chord and inspired you to stand up for your own worth, just drop the word "good" in the comments so I know this message reached the right people. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your incredible support, and remember to never let anyone dim your light.